10:15 in the morning, August 17, 1943, a rail platform outside a small station north of Renton Heath. Cold metal tasted in the air, a thin sheen of oil on leather gloves, gears and steam moving like a distant animal. Adolf Galland stood with a folded stack of reports that had the weight of inevitability, while Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring adjusted the braid on his sleeve and watched the world as if it were a parade. The report was simple in its cruelty, and it cut through protocol with a blunt, precise edge. American fighters equipped for long range were reaching deep into German airspace in numbers that made escort doctrine obsolete. Göring looked at the numbers and at the man, and he pronounced it unlikely, then impossible, as though that single judgment could alter physics. That refusal would ripple through command, through pilot rosters, and through the steel ribs of industry, and the cost would be measured in sorties not returned and in graves in foreign soil. Contemporary squadron logs showed P-38 sightings and engagements up to 150 miles inside German defensive airspace, sometimes escorted by P-47s and supported by long-range drop tanks, with encounters recorded on August 12 and August 15 that matched radio intercepts. Today, the narrative would reconstruct those logs, the argument that failed to convince, and the battle returns that made denial into catastrophe. If you follow decisions and consequences, subscribe for more deep studies that put documents and voices back at the center of events. The whine of engines, the metallic tang of aviation oil, and the nervous hush before a briefing would remain with every man who listened. Field reports accumulated like ledger entries and then became a chorus. Squadron leaders sent concise stamped telegrams, and fighter pilots added their own pencil scrawls to the margins of mission reports. Lieutenant Hartmann wrote from the 3rd Jagdgruppe that a formation of twin-boom fighters had crossed the coast at dawn, bearing external tanks and aggressive escort tactics. Oberleutnant Karl Meyer radioed that engines had a different timbre, a clean wheeze unlike the radio roar he knew, and that the fighters flew high and fast as if escorted by doctrine that allowed them to reach targets deep inland. Flight logs from August 12 listed encounters where P-38 profiles matched shapes and sketches, and maintenance records showed casings scraped by foreign gunfire in sectors where German radar had thought skies empty. An intelligence summary noted 9 independent sightings within a 7-day window, 3 combat contacts, 2 wounded pilots, and damage reports in factories near Kassel. Field mechanics like Otto Fischer noted unfamiliar alloy fragments in wreckage and the smell of aviation gasoline that seemed thinner, more refined than domestic blends. Each report was a small instrument, precise and discreet, but together they formed a pattern that demanded reassessment of escort doctrine. At 11 o'clock, Captain Richter of Fighter Command read the consolidated notes aloud. Multiple independent sightings of twin-boom fighters, with external drop tanks, range extending to 150 miles, escorting medium bombers close to our industrial belts. Rear Admiral von Stein, listening, tapped the table and said, "If accurate, this changes our assumption about safe depth and about where interceptors must be staged." 2 junior officers crowded the file and debated tactic trade-offs, citing sortie endurance, average fuel loads, and the strain on reserve pilots if intercept zones had to be pushed outward. The data was quiet but relentless, a technical drumbeat that insisted on movement. Sensory details layered the scene. The rustle of paper, the coffee bitter on the tongue of one officer, the muted clank of boots on metal flooring, and an undercurrent of humidity that made uniforms cling. Yet there was also the smell of authority, a perfume of metals and varnish, and the peculiar warmth of someone used to making closures with a phrase. Command met evidence with a different language. Galland entered the staff room with the reports and sought a direct exchange. The scene unfolded with a theatrical clarity, voices short, faces hard, and an exchange of 6 to 8 back and forths that would later be transcribed. "Hermann," Galland said, "we are being penetrated further than doctrine admits. P-38s with drop tanks are escorting raids into our depth." Göring replied with a laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Adolf, you exaggerate. Our radar would have warned us if such formations crossed. The idea that they could mount operations so deep without notice is absurd. Galland pushed a map across a lacquered table, nails leaving faint trails. We have at least 9 independent sightings in the last week, reports from Lieutenant Hartmann, Oberleutnant Meyer, and Captain Richter, plus debris analysis from Otto Fischer. They carry external tanks and they are operating at range. Göring tapped the map. Reports are unreliable. Pilots misidentify aircraft under stress. I will not upend our deployments on rumor. Galland's voice tightened. This is not rumor. Our intercepts show increased fuel consumption profiles and engagements near Kassel and Regensburg. If we do not adapt escorts, we will lose fighters on transit and bombers will reach factories unchallenged. Göring leaned back, slow and finishing. Then you will carry out the current orders and maintain discipline. We cannot be chasing shadows, and that is the decision. Galland, trapped by rank and by the need to persuade, angled his last argument. If we accept a shadow, we can reassign a handful of squadrons now, adjust patrol rings, and avoid attrition. The cost of inaction will be measured in pilots and production. Göring smiled thinly and dismissed the point. No change. The front holds. Each line carried taste and heat. Göring's breath a faint hint of cigarette smoke and cologne, Galland's gloves warm from gripping paper and cold from the knowledge of hanging stakes. The exchange ended with an order stamped and an opinion hardened into policy. The immediate consequences appeared as soon as doctrine met reality. On August 19th, bomber formation out of the Ruhr flew with the expectation of protective corridors, but their escorts were insufficiently forward. Encounters unfolded with kinetic bluntness, and the initial tactical losses bore a metric clarity. A raid that had expected an escort ratio of 3 fighters per bomb group instead faced an enemy with forward escort, and the Bomber Command recorded losing 12 aircraft in a single afternoon. The numbers arrived at command like final notices. Squadron records tallied sorties flown versus pilots returned, and the attrition rate climbed by 30% in 2 weeks. Mechanics reported an uptick in emergency landings, with fighters arriving back short on fuel, scuffed landing gear, and pilot fatigue manifest in trimmed logs and handwritten notes. One emotional dispatch from Flight Sergeant Ernst Bauer read, "We watched them come back like ghosts, planes that should not have been able to reach us, engines coughing, faces white with a fuel ache." The tactical climax came mid-afternoon when a group of escortless bombers passing over Regensburg were met by P-38s, whose presence had not been anticipated. The loss of experienced bomber crews and the destruction of a vital engine plant shifted calculations overnight. The first tension point was immediate and brutal. Pilots who had flown together for years were gone, and replacements arrived with training hours half of what veterans possessed. Families received telegrams with succinct language that tried not to be cruel but could not avoid it. The sense of a strategy cracking under a load it had not been designed to carry moved from calculation to grief. That afternoon, the smell of burned oil and twisted metal lingered in a way that no report could fully translate. Technical analysis clarified why the new fighter profiles mattered and what operational levers were at play. Drop tanks were simple and workmanlike devices that extended range by carrying extra fuel outside the fuselage, jettisonable when combat started. The process was straightforward, yet precise. Tanks were attached to hardpoints under wings, lines connected to fuel selectors, and a release mechanism allowed disposal when weight and drag became liabilities. Pilots commanded tank jettison through a cockpit lever that engaged a mechanical latch with a redundant hydraulic backup, tuned to avoid accidental separation on turbulence. Once dropped, tanks fell away in a predictable arc and often ruptured on impact, leaving fuel stains and identifiable aluminum fragments. These external tanks extended the P-38 endurance by roughly 70 to 100%, depending on load and cruise settings, allowing operations from the English coast to targets deep inside occupied airspace. Maintenance logs confirmed unfamiliar tank fittings on wreckage and fragments with rivet patterns not typical to German designs. The engineering note closed with the decisive line: "Extended range by external tanks changed the escort equation, and without countermeasures, the established patrol rings could not reliably intercept inbound threats." The introduction of this technological edge was not abstract. Pilots and technicians reacted with a mixture of tactical ingenuity and personal dread.
Among those named in reports were Werner Mulders, who had twice written of close calls at dawn, Gunther Lutzow, who advocated for forward staging, and Major Vogel, who argued for reserve squadrons kept at readiness near vulnerable industry. Hans Schumacher, a flight mechanic whose hands were never still, documented fuel line fittings that did not match any domestic schematics. Lieutenant Hartmann described the P-38 silhouette as a cockpit nest between twin booms, and Captain Richter recorded an encounter where an enemy fighter closed at high speed but broke off when met by fresh defenders. These voices populated the narrative of adaptation and resistance. The first test mission of an adjusted forward ring was scheduled with mixed hope. It exposed a gap in supply. The rapid redeployment of squadrons required extra sorties to ferry spare parts, and the attrition of experienced pilots meant the new forward bases were filled with men still learning to manage long-range navigation, night return procedures, and unfamiliar ground service routines. The second moment of tension arrived on a silent morning when a hastily staged group of interceptors failed to link with ground control for radar vectors and instead collided with weather layers, losing formation cohesion and several fighters to disorientation and crash. The reports of that day filled pages with the metallic smell of burned wiring and the sharp, bitter coffee sipped by officers in the aftermath. Attrition rates changed the arithmetic of frontal advantage. What had been assumed as a dominance of numbers shifted as production could not compensate for the loss of seasoned pilots. Monthly loss reports turned stark. A table in fighter command files showed that in June and July, the ratio of replacement to experienced fighter pilot was roughly 2 to 1, but by September that figure had swung the other way, as veteran numbers dwindled faster than training pipelines could supply. The result was a declining quality of cockpit time per pilot, with hours of flight training dropping from a pre-war average of 200 hours to below 100 for many replacements, as training schools prioritized basic competency to meet demand. Training pipelines broke down for logistical reasons as well, with instructors like Friedrich Klein pressed into operational flights and ground instructors stretched thin. Factory output of fighters remained high in reports, but the human factor made aircraft simple shells that needed capable hands. Two key tension moments developed in parallel with industrial statistics. One involved a squadron led by Captain Richter, who on a single sortie lost 3 of his best pilots to ambushes in sectors previously considered safe. The other moment played out at an assembly plant, where a night raid knocked out a key machine tool used for engine casings, halting a production line for 3 weeks and causing a domino effect in spare parts inventory. Those episodes combined to erode the previously reliable exchange rate of planes for pilots versus enemy bombers neutralized. The crisis in training and logistics became systemic rather than episodic.
Galland, who had been a combat pilot of renown and then a commander, had personal memory and institutional memory woven into his judgment. His backstory explained why he felt urgency where others saw inconvenience. He had been born into a small town in 1912, a child of a school teacher and a mechanic, learning early to read gauges and to imagine flight from a bicycle with a wooden frame and a tin engine. At 14, he had watched biplanes sketch the sky and vowed to learn their language. He trained rigorously, a cadet who spent long nights in classrooms and longer days in open cockpits, learning to parse clouds and read wind shear. In the 1930s, he moved through ranks with a reputation for clear eyes and a quick throat. He had lost a brother to an early air accident, a loss that etched a private code into his leadership. That absence made him meticulous with pre-flight checks and unsparing with reports from the front. He had known victory and cost, and he carried both in the way he asked questions. His childhood had taught him the smell of oil and the geometry of levers. His formation years had taught him the value of honest report and the danger of confident dogma. And present losses tested those lessons in a crucible of policy. The backstory stretched through 3 small paragraphs of memory and professional detail, filling the reader with an image of a man whose life had been a series of choices between risk and the obligation to minimize it, a man now pressed to persuade others of a simple technical truth. Secondary characters filled the institutional stage. Werner Mulders issued tactical reports and later stood at Galland's side in briefings, his voice an instrument of calm urgency. Gunther Lutzow maintained a steady drumbeat for tactical innovation, pushing for forward operating bases to catch long-range escorts before they could reach Ford factories and engine works. Hans Schumacher and Otto Fischer logged maintenance anomalies and metal fragments, often sending samples to labs for analysis. Captain Richter and Major Vogel commanded squadrons now stretched thin by the need to patrol newly distant rings. Friedrich Klein and Lieutenant Hartmann appeared in pilot logs and in letters that went between hangars. Their actions were specific. Lutzow argued for redeployment during a night conference. Mulders flew a reconnaissance mission to confirm sightings. Schumacher identified rivet patterns on a fragment. Richter lost pilots on a fatal escort failure. Vogel insisted on reserve rotation. Klein improvised training modules to cope with lack of instructors, and Hartmann described enemy tactics in stark radio reports. Each name anchored a sequence of practical acts that made the story about people as well as machines. The narrative never reduced them to archetypes. It kept the specificity of coffee stains, of cramped bunks, of the way hands smelled of solvent. Big operations magnified the problem. In early September, what commanders in London and Washington called a major offensive, and what Germans' staff referred to as increased pressure, concentrated sorties, and manufacturing attack campaigns into a period that would become known informally as a week of shredding. The statistics were brutal to parse. Monthly losses ticked upward, and the production numbers that had been cited as reassurance could not repair the human erosion. 2 detailed moments of tension unfolded during this campaign, each rendered in paragraphs that held breath and clench. The first involved a day when radar operators reported simultaneous inbound formations from 2 directions, stretching interception resources thin and forcing commanders to prioritize. Pilots scrambled from forward fields without full maintenance support and ran into coordinated long-range escorts that cut through bomber boxes with precision. The engagement left jagged wreckage and a thin, painful arithmetic of dead and wounded. The second moment was a supply convoy ambushed on a foggy morning. Its truck shipments of spare props and engine parts scattered and lost, forcing grounding of squadrons that could not be repaired locally. These 2 events, one tactical and one logistical, compounded to create a feedback loop of scarcity, and morale sagged. The writing of dispatches began to show a new cadence, clipped sentences, and a recurrent refrain of shortages. Command response came late and partial. The first introduction of jet interceptors, such as early MiG-262 prototypes and hastily modified piston fighters with altered climb profiles, arrived after significant losses. The new interceptors promised speed and a capacity to engage bombers before escort fighters could protect them, yet they arrived in numbers too small and with teething problems that exposed the limits of technological fixity. On the operational level, squadrons experimented with layered escort traps, baiting enemy escorts away with dummy transmissions and feints, but these tactics required coordination that full mobilization had made brittle. One critical episode found Major Vogel leading a mixed flight of early jets and older fighters in a dusk intercept. The engagement escalated quickly, and while the jets achieved initial surprise, fuel management and limited pilot experience with jet throttle response led to missed opportunities and the loss of aircraft on final approach when engines failed to spool correctly. The episode became a case study in what happens when a technology is offered as remedy before doctrine, logistics, and training align to use it. The tactical failure persisted because leadership had not fully integrated production realities into intelligence analysis. 3 moments of acute tension punctuated the latter operations, each drawn with tight sensory language and carrying 500 to 600 characters. Moment 1 occurred at dawn over Regensburg when a ragged bomber group lost formation under unexpected enemy pressure. Metal flashed and the smell of burned hydraulics filled the air as pilots radioed final terse coordinates and fuel blips sputtered. Moment 2 took place on a rain-slick runway where replacement pilots landed exhausted, tires skidding, engines coughing, and the hangar smelled of smoke and old leather as mechanics realized they lacked needed parts and improvised repairs with tape and hope. Moment 3 happened in a command tent at night, candlelight reflecting off maps as commanders argued in a rising voice about redeployment, and the room cooled when a fresh telegram announced yet another plant destroyed, the sound of the news falling heavy like a brick into still water. Each of these moments compressed anxiety and choice into a handful of sensory lines and human exchanges. Process explanations grounded the narrative in operational reality. When the Luftwaffe attempted to accelerate training to fill losses, the technical procedure for pilot qualification was compressed. Normally, a trainee progressed through primary flight, advanced navigation, gunnery, formation, and instrument instruction with incremental hours that built muscle memory. The accelerated process merged phases, cutting cross-country hours and reducing simulated combat time. Students were certified after a limited number of sorties with instructors who had themselves been pressed into active duty. This procedural change, described in records with clinical detachment, resulted in pilots rated as operational who had only a fraction of the experience of those they replaced. The documents laid bare a simple cause and effect link between hours flown and survivability, and the shortening of that cable tied directly to rising fatality rates. The late response of jet interceptors and the attempts to rework escort doctrine did not stop the erosion. A final mission in November aimed to test the integrated use of jets and conventional fighters to create interception layers, but execution lagged. A personal episode centered on Galland came in this period, a compact microdrama of 500 to 600 characters that illustrated the human cost. Galland stood on a rain-dark field as pilots returned, mud spattered around boots, faces hollowed by a month of strain. He greeted a young pilot he had tried to protect, who slumped against a crate and said, "Sir, I could not get there in time." Galland felt the weight of command and the taste of failure, a cold iron in the mouth that bespoke personal responsibility and institutional limits. Orders and technical fixes had arrived, but not in time to shield those already lost. The cumulative effect was not merely operational, it was strategic. The ratio of losses to replacement shifted. Air superiority in contested theaters became more fragile, and production gains could not be converted into regained advantage because the human capital was exhausted. Analytically, the mistake was not a single misreading of reports, but a pattern of preference for reassuring narratives over painful adaptation. Leadership had the option to accept uncomfortable evidence and act, or to cling to doctrine and hope for luck. Göring chose the latter, and institutional momentum favored maintenance of current deployments. Documents gathered in post-war analysis made this clear. Metrics and monthly reports spelled out the trend lines. Pilot hours per month decreased. Combat experienced pilots were lost faster than trainees could acquire skill, and the attrition gap widened. A month after the central confrontation, the picture looked grim, and the first phase of epilogue measured immediate adjustments and their costs.
1 month later, communication showed pockets of reorganization but not recovery. Forward staging had been authorized in limited sectors, but the redeployment required Tecker trucks and spare parts that were still on trains scheduled through contested lines. Training modules had been expanded, but the number of qualified instructors was insufficient, so class sizes increased while simulation hours decreased. Families were receiving replacement telegrams and local morale wavered. Battlefield consequences included a temporary reduction in escort coverage for a week as squadrons rotated and factories attempted to catch up on repairs.
The manufacturing gap was narrowing slightly, but the pipeline for experienced pilots had not rebuilt. Reports from frontline commanders noted that while defenses had been marginally extended, the defensive envelope still had soft spots and enemy long-range operations remained feasible. Strategically, the Germans had begun to acknowledge range as a factor, but their measures were reactive and under-resourced. The smell of oil and exhaust still pervaded airfields, and men spoke of the same names that had been lost, repeating them as if to make sure memory matched the ledger. 3 months on, the strain had become structural. Training programs had been reorganized, and a push for standardized instructor certification was underway, but the full effect of policy changes had not matured. Trap lines, deception tactics, and limited forward basing had reduced the frequency of deep penetrations in specific sectors, yet the enemy adapted with tactical countermoves and production of long-range drop tank-equipped fighters continued. Production figures showed that while aircraft output rose, the rate of pilot experience accumulation lagged. A new analytic report concluded that the exchange ratio had shifted from an advantageous 3-to-1 to near parity in some theaters, a fact that forced a rethinking of offensive plans. Supply chain vulnerabilities revealed in the earlier ambushes had led to hardened routes and more dispersed storage, but that dispersion came with inefficiencies. Politically, the refusal to accept early warnings had cost time and flexibility that could not be reclaimed easily. Within staff rooms, the language adopted was less categorical and more contingent, commanders writing of probabilities rather than certainties and adopting contingency plans that accepted increased consumption of resources. 6 months later, the legacy of the initial denial had solidified into consequence. The Luftwaffe still flew, still struck, and still defended, but its operational freedom had been narrowed. The attrition of trained pilots had a cumulative effect on mission success rates and on the confidence with which planners could commit to large-scale operations. Reconstruction of pilot training pipelines had improved, yet the time lag inherent in producing fully combat-ready pilots meant that parity on a per-mission basis had been costly. Industrial targets that had been hit during the months after the initial encounters continued to affect spare parts availability and engine production, creating a bottleneck in maintenance cycles. A strategic reflection emerged that linked the initial refusal to adapt to a cascade of shortages and losses measured in hundreds of sorties canceled, in dozens of units degraded, and in a long tail of wounded men and grieving families. The epilogue closed with a sober accounting, a ledger of decisions and consequences, and a recognition that the cost of a single dismissed report could not be fully repaired by technical patches or late policy reversals. In conclusion, the story of Galland warning Göring about long-range P-38 operations in 1943 and meeting doubt was not a parable about one stubborn man or one complacent leader alone. It was a study in how intelligence and tactics intersect with personalities, with industrial constraints, and with the inertia of doctrine. The human toll was unambiguous, measured in pilots dead and in families bereaved. The analytical lesson was equally clear. Numbers showed a declining exchange rate and a collapse of training depth that technological fixes could not instantly correct. Leadership that preferred comfort and certainty to inconvenient truth set the conditions for a protracted cost. 1 month later, adjustments were marginal. 3 months later, structural changes had begun but were incomplete. And 6 months later, the strategic landscape had shifted in ways that favored the opponent. If this analysis resonated with you, leave a comment starting with "I would," or "I would try to explain how you would act in the commander's shoes," and join the conversation. Your perspective helps the community think through choices under pressure and informs future episodes that will examine similar decisions in other theaters. If you value deep research and human narratives in military history, subscribe to the channel for more investigations that connect documents, voices, and tactical consequence. Thank you for following this reconstruction, and remember that decisions, once made, move fast and they rarely stop where they began.